Hey students, we're going to finish chapter 32 covering the crash of the stock market and the resulting depression. President Harding's unexpected death would bring Calvin Coolidge into office. Coolidge would win re-election in 1924 and continue his conservative economic and foreign policies. The United States had been historically a debtor nation, but by 1922 the United States was a creditor nation, with about $16 billion in loans to other nations. The U.S. Treasury held about $10 billion loaned to the Allied nations for the war, and Uncle Sam wanted his money back. The Allied nations would protest against paying the debt, saying that it was unfair. They would argue that the United States should write off the loans because the Allies had paid in the blood of millions of young men. They would complain that the United States already had a booming economy prior to the war and now profited from and after the war. Calvin Coolidge would respond with saying, quote, "They hired the money, didn't they?" In 1924, the international debt knot would become more complicated with the passage of the Dawes Plan. The Dawes Plan was negotiated by Charles Dawes, where Germany would be able to reschedule reparation payments and allow private loans to be taken out. This created a circle of American credit loans to Germany, then to France and Britain, and back to the United States Treasury. The entire system was supported by American creditors, but after the market crash in 1929, this system would fail. In 1928, Cool Cal Coolidge would announce that he would not seek the presidency again. Republicans would nominate wildly popular Herbert Hoover for the presidency. Democrats would nominate New Yorker Alfred E. Smith. Smith had nothing but an uphill battle with his campaign. Smith was known for his drinking during a time when publicly people were against it. Secondly, Smith was of Irish descent and a Roman Catholic. These qualities would turn away many voters, including the racist, domestic terrorist, and white supremacist group, the Ku Klux Klan. Hoover would win in a landslide, riding on its popularity from the war and his domestic policies. During the 1920s, there seemed to be no end of the prosperity of the stock market. Americans would seek to get rich quick on the raging bull market and buy stocks on margin. Margin is using loaned money to invest on the stock market. Meanwhile, farmers were crying out to the government for support as demand for their overproducing crops had dried up with the end of the war. Hoover would respond to the cries by signing the Agricultural Marketing Act in 1929. The act would set up the Farm Board, where it would purchase surplus crops from farmers at higher than market prices, supporting the failing farms. This would become disastrous when the price for wheat and cotton would plummet. The farmers soon would not be the only people crying out for economic help. On October 29, 1929, the stock market would crash. This day would be known as Black Tuesday. By the end of 1929, stockholders would lose over $40 billion in their investments. This loss was bigger than the cost of the entire World War for the United States. This would result in a terrible depression that no other industrialized nation would ever experience. This was made worse with the passage of the Hawley-Smoot Tariff in 1930. The tariff was an attempt to protect domestic farming and other industries. The tariff started with a modest tax, but soon was raised to unpalatable levels. By the end of 1930, more than 4 million workers in the United States were jobless. In 2 years, that number would triple. Over 5,000 banks would fail in 3 years, and with them the life savings of thousands of Americans. Bread lines and soup kitchens would become a commonplace across the nation, and during this time, shanty towns would spring up across the nation and would be nicknamed Hoovervilles. The stiff individualist Hoover was very resistant to implement government action. It was not until local governments begged for help from the federal government that Hoover would move away from his rugged economic outlook. Hoover would allow the government assistance to banks, railroads, and other businesses in the hopes that they would in turn hire people back to work. Hoover was sharply criticized for this action, but it very well may have stopped the Depression from getting worse. Meanwhile, thousands of men who fought in the war would lobby for the early payment of their war bonuses that was pushed back to 1945. Veterans would come together and make the bonus expeditionary force and march to Washington, D.C. with 20,000 soldiers. Congress managed to pass a bill that would pay about 6,000 soldiers their full benefits, but the rest refused to leave until they were given the same. Hoover was growing impatient and disapproved of the unsanitary shanty towns the veterans had erected. Hoover would send the army, led by future war hero General Douglas MacArthur. This would prove to be a terrible move. The army would set fire to shacks, throw tear gas into the crowds of veterans, and result in the death of 2 men and allegedly an 11-month-old baby. While the United States was suffering from the Great Depression, Japan took the opportunity to expand the rising sun's rays. Japan would take the Chinese province of Manchuria, slapping the face of the League of Nations. Japan would bombard Shanghai, resulting in high deaths of civilians. The League of Nations was powerless to intervene as the United States refused to be a member, and the European nations involved were dealing with financial chaos of their own. The United States would issue a very hollow statement to Japan stating that the United States would not recognize new Japanese territories, but without the American Navy to back up the statement, it meant nothing. This event would arguably be one of the first events of the Second World War prior to the rise of Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. Alright students, that's it for this chapter. Make sure that you are reading your books, wash your hands, and do not touch your face, and stay indoors.